Hi there, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Sarah O'Leary from Myosh. The webinar today is on what is human and organisational performance, known as HOP, and it'll be presented by Andy Shon. Andy Shon is the CEO of Southpac Group. Southpac International was established to assist organisations and business leaders to get the very best from their people and from their systems. They can help your organisation move off the plateau of performance, improve safety, while also simultaneously improving across all your other key objectives. Now, just about the webinar today, there's a Q&A panel. Please pop your questions in there. Only use the chat panel if you want to send me a text direct or send text to panelists. We'll answer questions at the end. As with all our webinars, we will record it and we will share via email a podcast for if you want to listen on a device, and a slide share and a copy of the actual webinar. So over to you, and thank you for joining us, Andy.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Appreciate having the opportunity to speak to your clients and market audience again this week. Hopefully there's some people who have been tuned into previous weeks as well and heard about learning teams and about the safety differently. So there may be a little bit of overlap from last week to this week. Reason being primarily because the organizations that are looking at HOP are the kind of organizations that have also been looking at safety differently. Because they're interested in doing things differently. So what is HOP? What is human and organizational performance? So we'll talk a little bit about the 5 principles and what makes up HOP in a moment. But I guess it's worth drawing attention to the reason why organizations are looking at new approaches. There's 2 pictures here which people might be, if you haven't seen any of these before, be thinking, what the heck is this all about? Why are we showing pictures of sausage sizzles and graveyards? Well, there is no direct link between these 2 pictures. On the left-hand side is relates to an article that broke last year here in Australia after the kind of Bunningsgate scandal, whereby the national press kind of lost the plot over the fact that Bunnings had been sending memos to all of their staff in relation to their correct application of tomato ketchup or mustard or whatever and onions on the sausage sizzle, due to the fact that some onions and ketchup had fallen on the floor and someone had slipped on it in one of their sites. And potentially, rightly, the press was saying, well, as a large organisation like Bunnings got nothing better to be doing and nothing better to be focusing on in their safety activities than little bits of onion and ketchup falling on the floor. And we see this kind of in organizations all around the place. And Greg Smith has a word for it, kind of trivial safety or trivializing safety, where we end up focusing on very kind of low order, kind of insignificant events. And that kind of really starts to kind of, both it puts our people offside in terms of thinking, what really is this what safety's become, like the nanny state? And it also potentially is taking up our time from focusing on potentially more important things. On the right-hand side, the picture relates to a graveyard in Plymouth in the United Kingdom, where a council had done an inspection of the graveyard and for all intents and purposes then defaced any of the gravestones they considered to be hazardous, i.e. they could fall over and hurt someone. Again, people got very upset about this, particularly the family members. And says, well, why did you need to deface these gravestones? Or at the very least, could you not have put this on the reverse side of the gravestone? So we think, well, is this really what safety is about now? Kind of putting signs on unstable gravestones. Interestingly, the council kind of would probably make a response, well, we need to do this. We've got liability here. We need to be able to ensure we're protecting the council from potential liability should anyone get injured by a falling gravestone. But again, the interesting thing here is, well, this is kind of safety being done in the name of liability management. But in actual fact, they may find that they're actually increasing their liability because they've identified a potential hazard, and rather than doing anything about it, they just put a sign on it. So it's an interesting quandary, this kind of, do we do something about something when in reality the risk is already very low, but then potentially by doing an action like this, we're actually potentially increasing our liability. So this kind of trivializing and bureaucratizing of safety is kind of like a recurring theme across lots of industries, and beyond even Australia, lots of other countries are starting to experience this. So human and organizational performance is a way of kind of saying, well, let's kind of get back to what safety is about. It's about looking after our people, but also HOP, as similarly to safety differently, is also about, well, it's not just about safety. It's about how do we make work better, because we generally find that we make work better, safety outcomes improve. So critically, as we said with safety differently last week, HOP is not a program. It's not something we can just pick up and buy off the shelf and say, okay, we've got the new posters, we've got the new policies, we've got the new buzzwords we're going to use. We just need to do a few of these new tools, and hey, presto, we're doing HOP now. HOP is an operating philosophy. It's a way of thinking about the world, about how work happens, what safety is, how safety is created and broken, what are appropriate interventions into the workplace and what are not. So there's a whole lot of kind of thought process and ethos and philosophy that goes with HOP. And they try and encapsulate these within the 5 principles of HOP, of human and organizational performance. So our 5 principles here, which you may have seen if you've seen the earlier webinars on learning teams, and we're going into these in a bit more detail in a moment. Firstly, that people make mistakes. We're all human, and therefore we all make errors and mistakes at various different times. And that's something we just have to accept. Secondly, especially bearing in mind that first principle, blame fixes nothing. Again, blaming is a very human thing to do. We are all human. It's a trap for us all to fall into, that when things go wrong, immediately look for someone to blame. That's a human response, but it's not useful. It doesn't make us better. It doesn't enable learning. It doesn't enable improvement. So blame really just has fixed nothing. And what it gets us in the way of us learning about context. So our third principle is that context drives behavior, or you could say context influences and shapes behavior. So when we see people doing things which we might think, well, that's crazy, why would they do that? We're focusing on the behavior or the decision or whatever we want to label it. But if we take a step back and look at the conditions and the context, then things start to make more sense to us. So HOP is very interested in context and conditions, and less on choices or causes. Our fourth principle is that learning is vital. Learning about the organization, learning about work, learning about what makes success and what potentially contributes to failure, and creating a learning environment where the organization is continually learning and getting better. And our fifth principle, response matters. So how we respond, all of us, how we respond when things go wrong is really important, but also how we respond when things are going well. There are good responses and bad responses in both of those scenarios. So that's kind of our 5 principles. And there's a whole lot of other ideas and concepts that sit under each of these principles. Now, our little ball on the right-hand side there, which we use it's our kind of logo for HOP. The reason we use an elastic band ball is to show the kind of the interdependency and the interrelatedness of these 5 principles. You can't take one without the others. They're all very much reliant on each other, and HOP as a philosophy needs to be taken as a whole. We need to take a holistic approach in terms of how we apply this within the workplace, within the organization. So it has to be understood as a whole, but equally we have to understand work as a whole. We can't just focus on small parts. So it's very much related to systems thinking, complexity science, in terms of understanding the whole of something, as opposed to a reductionist approach, which is about understanding small parts and thinking we can improve if we just improve the parts. So our first principle, people make mistakes. Now, we said before, that's just part of being human. Now, that's not kind of being said in a fatalistic way, oh, well, we're all going to make mistakes, we're all going to make errors, let's not bother trying to improve. That's not the point. But the point is, if we expect people to operate at 100% of the time, we're going to be disappointed, like a lot, because it's just not realistic. humans, we know for a fact, are very good at some things and not so great at other things. And if we ignore that at our peril. So we kind of, when we do hot training, whether it's with frontline people or with senior leadership, one of the first things we get them to do is to reflect on a time they made an error or a mistake in work. And I'd like you all just to take a moment just to think about a time in your career where you've made an error or a mistake in work, maybe one that had consequences. It could have been something related to safety or it could be something else. But think, firstly, how did that make you feel when you made that mistake? Because pretty much all of us will be able to remember that point and think, well, it made me feel pretty crappy, actually. Was it a deliberate action? Well, no. Almost by definition, most errors and mistakes are intentional. Certainly the consequence is unintentional. So it gets us to think a little bit more deeply, this principle that, well, people generally don't go to work to screw things up, to ruin their supervisor's day, to kind of cause merry hell. That's not what's going on here. People make mistakes or involved in errors as a consequence of other things. And some of these things are knowable. So this is kind of moving us beyond the conversation of kind of like, oh, if people try harder or they kind of concentrate more or put their heart into it, they're less likely to make mistakes. That's quite a seductive sort of idea, but is really kind of not very useful. There's a program in the United States which has been used in aviation maintenance, which scares the hell out of me. The fact that in an aviation maintenance environment, they have a program called Hearts and Minds. And one of the kind of taglines is, you win the war on error, one heart and mind at a time. And I think that's just so dangerous on so many levels, because for one, it's kind of assuming that people make errors because for one, they don't care, or for second, they're not thinking. And it's like, well, I'm not really sure what else you can do with that. Okay, the response is what make people care more or make people think more. I think, well, people think about as much as they can at any given time, given the context of the work and the demands of the work and what they're doing. And generally speaking, I think we assume in HOP that, well, people do already care. They don't go to work to screw things up. They don't want to hurt themselves. They don't want to hurt their colleagues. So we kind of run out of road of what we're going to do with the hearts and minds kind of conversation. So if we take a slightly different view, we say, well, looking beyond human error and mistakes and so forth, we look at this quote from Decker, and he says, underneath every simple, obvious story about human error, there's a deeper, more complex story about the organization. So that's what we're interested in. Okay, what is the context in which mistakes and errors happen? We know that there are many situations whereby it's kind of predictable that we know people can maybe make errors and mistakes. Therefore, it's not about so much about the errors and mistakes. It's also about, well, what organizational response do we put there? What kind of capacities can we put in place to make this either less likely or less significant if they happen? What other protection can we put into the system? So first up, people are, we're humans, therefore we make mistakes. With that in mind, then our second principle, blame fixes nothing. And that's, I think, just a pretty true statement in the vast majority of instances. Blame does not fix anything. It might make you feel better. It might be in an emotional way. You kind of get something out of it, but it doesn't make the system better. It doesn't make the work better. It doesn't make you any better or smarter. The person who receives the blame, they're no better off either. And if anything, it kind of just teaches the organization, rather than getting caught, try and cover things over. Well, there's a very deep kind of place where kind of blame comes from. Nietzsche talks about this like 120, 130 years ago. He talks about here that the unknown brings with it danger, disquiet, and worry. One's first instinct is to get rid of these awkward conditions. We don't like unknown things. So something goes wrong, something goes bang in the night. And we go, oh, this isn't good. We don't like the unknown as humans. We like to explain away unknowable things and put a reason to it, some logic to it. And as Nietzsche says here, the first idea which can explain the unknown is known. feels so good that it's held to be true. But we see that with human error all the time. How often do we see accidents, incidents that make it into the media, and almost the first go-to position is, either human error or human error hasn't been ruled out yet. So it's kind of like, well, this complex thing which has happened, which is kind of messy and involved and multifaceted, and there's a lot of nuanced kind of argument within it. We can just sanitize all of that away into this kind of very simple story of, someone screwed up, and that person, we can pin it all on them, we can blame them, and that takes away all of the rest of the worry and disquiet. And it's a bit of a mental shortcut for us. So blame is really not useful, though, in terms of allowing us to learn about the kind of the messy, complex story that sits behind the vast majority of things that go wrong, but also things that go right too. So we really like this expression, and I know it kind of makes an impact with our clients, because sometimes people will say to me months or even longer afterwards, and they'll use this expression, "Don't blame the lettuce." So we know it's making an impact, but this quote I think is really nice. It means when you plant lettuce, if it doesn't grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it's not doing well. It may need fertilizer or more water or less sun, but you never blame the lettuce. It would be senseless to blame the lettuce. Yet if we have problems with our friends or family, or we could say our workers, we blame the person. So it's like, well, we give more consideration to a lettuce, an inanimate thing, as opposed to people. Why is that? See, the lettuce doesn't do well. We go to the conditions. What do we need to do to enable this lettuce to grow and to thrive? Or what if we took that perspective with safety, or with our workforce? What do we need to create or change in the conditions to enable growth, to enable the person or the people to do better? So that again ties nicely then into our third principle, which is the fact that context drives or influences behavior. Now, this is an example I think I used last week in the Safety Differently discussion, but we use this discussion or analogy a lot. Who has been to a supermarket with the sole mission to buy milk? Pretty much everyone at some point has been to one of the major supermarkets just with that one mission in mind: buy milk. Now, where is milk located in a supermarket? Pretty well, we all know that it's at the very back left corner or the very back right corner of the supermarket. Now, why do they do that? Why do supermarkets do that? It's because they've got a really good understanding of human psychology and how we work. They've got us worked out as consumers, and they want us to buy as much stuff as possible. That's kind of what they're in business to do: part us with our hard-earned and get us to spend as much as possible, right? So if they put the milk right at the front, that's making the objective harder to achieve. So they're not going to tell us to buy more, but they're going to create context and conditions that make it more likely. So part of that is by, putting the milk far away from the door. So you have to walk through the whole store and walk past all the aisle ends and all the special offers and all the orange and yellow stickers they put on everything, so it kind of stands out more. And we go, oh, that's a good kind of offer. I'll take advantage of that. Make us feel like we're getting a bargain. So they understand the things that make us tick, and they create conditions and context that make it easy for us to spend more money. So how do we equate this into our workplace? Well, we don't want to try and necessarily think in that way in terms of being manipulative, in terms of trying to achieve a particular outcome. But how can we create context and conditions which drive the behaviors we want? See, if we're seeing behaviors in the workplace we're unhappy about, we can focus on the behavior, or we can focus on the conditions and the context. And focusing on the conditions and context mean we're more likely to get the outcomes that we want once we start to understand those drivers and the things that are shaping and influencing behavior. So we like to use these 10 principles as a means of helping us to understand context. This is from a paper called Systems Thinking for Safety. by a guy called Stephen Sharrock, who works with the air traffic control management people back in Europe, Eurocontrol. And they put this paper together, and it's really quite useful in terms of what are some of the things we need to think about when we're trying to understand the wider context, the systems in which people work. And they kind of describe it this way. If you want to understand that context and those conditions, first of all, you need to have the field experts involved, i.e. the people who do the work every day. So the people who do the work, they know about the context, how the work happens, how it really happens, not how we think it happens. So we need them involved, but they also can help us understand local rationality, by which we mean people do things that make sense to them at the time. So if we want to understand what the decisions people make and the actions they carry out in the workplace, if we speak to them and find out of the world they operate in, then it starts to make more sense to us why the decisions they make and the things they do make sense and why it's locally rational. But in order to be able to do that, in order for people to really kind of share that expertise with us and to share that local rationality, there has to be that kind of protection. They have to be able to feel safe to be able to do that. And that's where that kind of just culture, or as we'd say in hot, blame fixes nothing, kind of comes in. If we can create an atmosphere where that we can hear what's being said and respond appropriately, then we get all that rich information, the information that we really need to get better. So when we begin these conversations, what we really start to understand is those conditions that affect your work. So it's got here demand and pressure and resources and constraints. So there are many different demands and pressures that are there, ever present in the workplace. Obviously, commercial pressures are always there, but there are other pressures too. So when we start to understand that demand and pressure, but also the fact that there's never perfect resources in any organization, there's never always perfect, there's sufficient amounts of time, equipment, tooling, information, and the constraints on the system are generally very rarely perfectly balanced the system, so the rules and the guidelines never perfectly fit. So when we start to understand the kind of the morass of demand and pressure and resources and constraints, and start to understand how our people kind of navigate through that on a daily basis, we start to understand how success is created, but also how failure sometimes can happen too. So we won't talk too much about the other elements there, but what that ultimately leads to then is, because of this demand and pressure and resources and constraints, we see kind of variability. We see variability and trade-offs, but that's not because people just want to decide to make trade-offs. So I'm not going to do this, I'm going to do this instead, or I'm going to kind of not do it by the book, I'm going to do it my own way. That's not just because they felt like doing it that way. It directly relates back to the demand and pressure and the resource constraints. So we speak to the people, they can help us to understand. So we need to take a wider view, but we also kind of, even at a local level, need to think about, well, how does the physical things in the context affect decision making and actions? This is a Norman door, named after Don Norman, who wrote the book The Design of Everyday Things. And it's become called a Norman door because he talks about it in his book. It's a stupid design, because a Norman door is one where you have the same handle on both sides, but it only pushes on one side and pulls on the other. So in this example here, there's a pull handle. People are instinctively going to go to want to pull that. But so they've had to write on there, well, this is actually a push. Well, that's kind of, if we were to stand by and watch a Norman door, if we had the time just to stand and watch and observe how people interact with it, we'd find pretty predictably, a good portion of people would interact with this door in the wrong way. They'd go to pull rather than push, even if the writing is there saying push. Now, is that a human problem, or is that a design problem? So even when we look at the very specific context around people's work and get interested in that, then we start to see how that also has an influence and shapes people's behavior and the decisions they make. So we get a lot more curious. That leads us to want to learn more. And we know learning is generally considered to be a good thing, but in HOP, we're all about operational learning from our day-to-day work and how it happens, where the pain points are, where we can improve it, where we can make it better. Because if we do that, with that greater understanding, we can make better decisions, and that improves safety, but other outcomes too, quality and reliability and so forth. So one of the things we immediately kind of begin to accept in HOP is the fact that, well, asks the question here, is failure bad? Well, failure doesn't necessarily have to be bad. You know, trial and error, there's results by definition in lots of things that go wrong, but it also allows us to learn and develop, and allows us to be able to figure out things. Well, this works and this doesn't work. Many of our great inventions have been created through a process of trial and error. So failure isn't necessarily a bad thing. The situation here, the miracle on the Hudson, Sully was able to pull off this miraculous landing. We'd call that in HOP a successful failure. Why is it a successful failure? Well, because realistically, no one plans on landing on the Hudson unless you're a seaplane. However, it was a good outcome in the terms that everybody survived. Now, what we mean by, you know, success and failure and the difference between them oftentimes is pretty subjective. If you were at LaGuardia Airport and you were asked, okay, this aircraft is going to be ditching on the Hudson, do you still want to get on board? Pretty much everyone would say, no, thanks. I'm not interested in taking that particular ride. I'll wait for the next flight. I'm going to South Carolina. Once you were on the aircraft and departed, and you were at 3,000 feet, and then you lost both engines, and someone gave you the same choice. Okay, we're going to ditch on the Hudson, but everyone's going to survive. Would you take that same outcome at that point in time, as opposed to the great unknown? Absolutely, you would. You'd be like, well, I'm totally happy with that. I'm totally fine with that if I know we're going to make a forced landing or a ditching on the Hudson and we're all going to survive. So it's the same outcome. The only thing which has changed is our perspective of where we are with that outcome, either knowing it up front or knowing it once it's too late to change it. So we need to start seeing, particularly failures that have been free of harm or any serious bad consequence, rather than seeing them as failures as being a learning experience. It's an opportunity for us to learn more about the system in terms of learning how it works and how the work happens and how we can make it better. So it's this movement from, okay, we don't need to fix everything, but we can see when things go wrong as being an opportunity to learn. Now, probably the most important, one of the single most important concepts in HOP is this kind of idea of work as planned versus work as imagined, or work as planned versus work in practice. The black line and blue line, as we call it in HOP. Every organization in the world has a black line and a blue line. The black line, of course, is the plan, the procedures, the policies, the regulations, the guidelines. This is how stuff happens. Reality is the blue line, because the work is always variable. It's always variable and adaptable and changing in response to the context. And every organization we go to has a blue line. I'm confident to say every organization that's represented listening on this webinar would be in the same position. Work varies. No procedure can ever perfectly define work or describe how work happens. And our people are constantly adapting and responding to the real-time kind of changes in the environment and the context to make work happen. Now, what we traditionally see with investigations in a lot of organizations, and I've seen this in many industries, when an accident happens, as depicted here on the diagram now, it's very easy to come along in this situation and go, okay, we found the cause. They were doing the blue line and the black line specifies something different. So they should have been doing X, but they were actually doing Y. We found the cause. Well, all you've identified is the gap. That's not the same as the cause. This variability is present throughout all the normal work and is there all the time, but it's not resulting in an accident all the time. So we're not so interested in kind of nail down, oh, well, we found the cause. We're more interested in saying, well, we need to understand the blue line and why it's there. We're far more curious about that. And understanding also when our people are varying, how far away are they from this red line in terms of what is the margin of safety? That's what we're a lot more interested in. So, as it mentions here, workers are masters of complex adaptive behavior, masters of the blue line. They understand the blue line, and they can talk to us and explain to us the blue line, the pressures and the things that they are under. And then why sometimes the blue line, just even when there's no pressure, the blue line may make more sense. So rather than taking this kind of linear view from the kind of Swiss cheese model, which is in terms of how it's being applied, is generally considered an aberration anyway. Even James Reason made this statement back in 2006. The Swiss cheese model does not provide a detailed accident model or a detailed theory of how the multitude of functions and entities in a complex socio-technical system interact and depend on each other. So Reason said, well, the Swiss cheese model wasn't a model. It's just kind of like a metaphor. When things go wrong, lots of things go wrong. It's not just down to the people at the sharp end. Don't blame the people at the sharp end. Look at the wider system. That was kind of the point he was making with the Swiss cheese model. He did not intend for them to go away and turn this into a detailed model of how accidents happen and therefore what to look for in the rubble. We know in actual fact, accidents and incidents and events tend to be a whole combination of lots of messy things, lots of messy, which we call here the messy story. But equally, all of those things tend to be present in successful work as well. So it's not so much that these things are the cause, it's more just these things are present in the work and they can couple in unexpected ways. More often than not, they couple in a way which still allows us to be successful. Sometimes they couple in a way in which it leads to bad outcomes. So the difference between success and failure is oftentimes only the difference is the outcome, not the actual conditions that are present when the work was ongoing. So we've become a lot more interested in understanding the messy story of both success and of failure. And the thing that really kind of allows us to be able to do that then, and to be able to do that well, is through being able to manage our response. Managing the response, particularly when things go wrong, but also when things are going well. So as Todd Conklin says, you can learn and improve, and you can blame and punish, but you can't do both. But learning and improving is north on the compass, blame and punish is south. You can't go in two directions at the same time. So you have to make your choice. Do we want to learn and improve when things go wrong? Or do we want to blame and punish, which sometimes may be called accountability? But we can have accountability without having blame and punishment. So we need to move towards approaches which allow us to be restorative in approach, restore what's been damaged, including trust, potentially between the people involved and the organization. And that requires us to then therefore take a more appropriate response. When we use the term response matters because response is different to react. See, getting angry and losing the plot and so forth, that's a reaction. And it's driven by emotion. Response is a deliberate, thought through act. When things go wrong, we want to respond appropriately. So response is to look out for. We want to stop and avoid things like, you can't fix stupid, if only they had done X instead of Y. What were they thinking? Why did no one stop the work? Had they done a job safety analysis or job risk assessment or whatever the case may be? Because that's really just, something's gone wrong and let's try and protect the organization. These things aren't useful responses, nor are they good for developing the kind of culture we want. So we have to get a lot more interested, a lot more curious. Like first thing, even before this, are the people okay? How do we make the situation more likely? Or how do we contribute? What's the organization's responsibility here? What can we learn from this? These are all better questions rather than kind of emotional responses. Because one thing we know for sure, the people who are involved didn't deliberately cause this. And if they did, well, then we probably need to call in the police because that's a whole different problem. So people make decisions, as we said before, that are locally rational at the time. Now, after the event, we can often speak in counterfactuals and say, if only they had done X instead of Y. But that doesn't go to help us explain or understand why they did what they did. In actual fact, oftentimes people operate in what we call a gray area. uncertain, kind of. There's obviously a very safe way to do things that feels often overly cautious, and there's also a kind of very obviously that's a dangerous thing to do. It's clearly not safe to do things that way. But people generally operate somewhere in between, in this kind of grey area. It doesn't feel too cautious, but it doesn't feel too safe, unsafe, should I say. But after the event, then it becomes obvious. Hindsight bias kicks in. Oh, it was clearly that was the right way to do things. That was clearly the wrong way to do things. So hindsight just gets in the way and stops us from being curious, and it makes it very easy for us to blame. Like, they should have known better. They should have made a better decision. They should have been thinking more. Maybe they cared more, or whatever the case may be. So they're the kind of responses we want to try and manage when things go wrong. But I also mentioned about the fact that we also need to manage our response when things seem to be going well. Is the assumption when things are going well because our systems are great, we've got everything under control, our metrics are looking great, so that means we must be doing all the right things. Well, that can be a problem too. The right response means we maintain what we call in operational humility. We're still interested and curious. How are we creating this success? Is it through luck, or is it through good management and planning? Let's go and find out. So then through learning from normal work and learning from our everyday work and learning the messy story of how success is being made, we are able to get better as well. So the response matters both when things are going well as well as when things go wrong. Typically, one of the things we see and observe in many organizations is the pressure to fix generally outweighs the pressure or the desire to learn. So something goes wrong, something goes bang in the night, whatever the case may be. By and large, many organizations want to have root cause actions, corrective actions, all sorted out in a very short period of time. And what we find then is we often fix the wrong things. It's like the amount of times that we see things like safety memos and reminders and things like that, toolbox talks being delivered and things like that. Remember to follow the procedure, and you should be doing it this way and should be doing it that way. And sometimes that may be appropriate, but ultimately what it's depriving us of when we do that, it's stopping us from having to then go out and question and look a bit more deeply at the event and actually learn about the context, and therefore being able to make some more long-term sustainable changes, which are actually going to change and improve the work rather than just reinforcing the existing rules or standards. So in those early stages and early moments after things go wrong, we're more interested in just responding and containing in an appropriate way, but then waiting till we have the time, or allowing time for effective learning to happen. This allows us to get better solutions that improve the work, not just create more safety work. So as it mentions here, we want to slow down and learn, not to glacial pace, but certainly slow down to the point that we're able to get good learning. And we have to get better at accepting the fact that, well, learning is action too. It's a deliberate process, it's action. Once we've done that learning, we may say, well, this is probably really not much else we can change here, and actually making more further changes may be detrimental to the organization. Sending out a memo telling people to be careful how they put their tomato ketchup and onions on a sausage sizzle may be doing more harm than good. Maybe it's appropriate for us to do nothing. So if we do the right learning, better actions will follow. So as we mentioned, this is a very kind of brief intro to HOP. We can spend several hours on each principle, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a feeling for what the philosophy is about. So people make mistakes. We're all human. Mistakes happen. Blame might feel good, but it fixes nothing, and it stops us from being able to develop and to learn and to grow. Context drives behavior, so we're a lot more interested in understanding the context and conditions of the work, understanding how that shapes the decisions and behaviors and the actions of our people. Learning is vital. Learning about that messy story of work and the kind of story of complexity and coupling rather than of causes and choices. And what kind of ties it all together is our response, how we respond, both when things go well and when things don't go so well. So there are 5 principles of HOP. If you're interested in reaching out to us, obviously our contact details are here. The HOP Lab is a set of resources which are freely available. There's a whole host of videos, and we're constantly releasing new videos and concepts from thought leaders there, and that's got its own YouTube channel. So just put in HOP Lab into YouTube and you'll find the channel there, which we've got quite a lot of new material being released at the moment. But also you can connect with me personally or the company through LinkedIn as well. So so that's the presentation. Thanks very much again, Sarah, for having us. I'm happy with the questions.
Thank you, Andy. I can't see any questions as yet, but I'm sure, here we go. David asks, this is an organisational level philosophy. How are you finding the uptake of it by organisations at all levels?
It's a good question. By and large, at an operations level, we find it very easy, because even when we talk about HOP with people who work at the front line, they kind of go, yeah, and they already know all of this stuff. You know, they're familiar and au fait with the ideas, even if they're not familiar with the terminology. So we don't generally get any pushback at an operations level. And even in large organizations, we sometimes find that there's an operational pull for this, because they find it a lot more useful than maybe some of the traditional safety approaches that the organization's been taking. So the organizations that we've been working with, we've found, surprisingly, we thought we'd get a lot more resistance, but most organizations across the board, people are very keen. Most of the reservations we get, and this is only just very recently an oil and gas site I was at, they pretty much were saying, this is great, however, our senior leadership on board. So their only reservation is, well, we've got no problems with the ideas and the concepts. We just want to know, is the organization really committed to doing it? But for those organizations that are certainly are keen and committed, it's a very easy message to get on board with for a lot of people.
All right. Next question is, following David's question, which industries have the best HOP uptake in Australia? Have you worked with mining?
So we've had a couple of people from mining come and do some training, but we haven't worked closely with any mining organisations yet. However, in response to the Brady report, particularly in Queensland, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for mining organisations to engage with HOP, because mining, much the same as other high-risk businesses, have got a lot to gain from the insights that they can get from taking an approach like HOP. Learning teams is one of the methods we use in HOP. Would be, a great tool to be able to understand the critical controls and how effectively they're being implemented in the workplace, but also understanding the conditions of work better and so forth. So that would really go to some of the recommendations and from the Brady report. But organizations that seem to be doing this well, there's a real interest in oil and gas. Oil and gas companies in the States have been doing this for a little while, and that's starting to influence players here in Australia. We have a number of manufacturing clients as well who are interested. So there's a real kind of construction. There's a number of construction companies who are involved in HOP. And of course, Queensland Urban Utilities in Brisbane have been probably one of the most well kind of written about and reported on, done some great things. So I think it cuts across almost any industry, really.
Okay, thank you. Jeff asks, how do emerging neuroscience discoveries link with HOP?
Yeah, so that's interesting. The whole neuroscience conversation is very interesting, but my general observation is that neuroscience is, again, looking at the individual and looking at people, whereas HOP is more looking about, we're interested in people, but how people interact and how they operate in the context of their work. So I can't say a great deal much more about the neuroscience stuff, but I don't tend to find it tends to be the behavior-based safety sort of practitioners who tend to be most interested in the neuroscience side of things.
David asked, just culture looks like it plays a key part in this. How important is it from your perspective, and how difficult is it to change the culture of an organisation?
Yeah, so culture is obviously really important. We just tend not to use the culture word because it tends to be one of those things when you when you go into an organization and start talking about culture, probably rightly, people are sick to death of hearing about culture, particularly safety culture. So we don't really use that terminology very much at all. And because primarily we're not focused on changing the culture. We know that's one of the things that will happen over time when you start taking this kind of philosophy on board and when you start operating in this particular way. But we're focused on the specific actions and decisions and the communications and things like that that are happening in the organization. And when you do that over time, culture will change. Because ultimately culture is obviously the beliefs and values of the organization. And I don't think you can target those directly and deliberately to try and change them. But I think that generally doesn't work. But what you can do is target the things that the organization does. And through doing that, you will, essentially obliquely change the culture. So culture change is hard, but especially hard if you're focusing on trying to change culture. So our kind of answer is don't try and focus on changing culture. Focus on the things you can do and the things you can change and manage, and the culture will take care of itself over time.
Yong asks, what will be the KPIs if the organisation is practicing implementing HOP properly?
So metrics and measures almost invariably come up. So what we typically say is don't introduce anything initially. So we know that lag indicators and so forth are here still with us and will probably always still be with us. One of the things we'd say straight away is stop publicly promoting and talking about your lag indicators, because I think that has as many negative consequences as it potentially has positive. But you have to still keep on capturing these things and start thinking about, well, if safety is not the absence of things going wrong, safety is the presence of positive capacity to make things go well. If that's the case, what are some of the things you might be interested in measuring? Not necessarily to put on a billboard anywhere or even report to the board or anything like that, but what are things you'd be interested in understanding in terms of capacity? How much do we have of these various different types of capacities? Another thing which is interesting in potentially measuring, and we've seen this done through the use of net promoter score, is asking how well people think the organization is managing safety, asking the organization that, and then changing that, or monitoring that on an ongoing basis and seeing how that changes. Are people's perception of safety changing for the better over time when you start doing something like this? And generally what we find is, yes, people's perception does change. They think, well, the organization is doing some pretty good stuff here with this HOP and whatnot.
Jovan asks, what are your thoughts on companies' zero harm philosophy?
So I'm not going to be super controversial here and wave and say, oh, zero harm is all crap and all this kind of stuff, which is sometimes the response. I think zero harm as an aspiration is a perfectly reasonable aspiration for an organization to have. Yes, we don't, ultimately as safety people, we don't want to have an organization where we're routinely hurting people, whether it's, but ultimately zero harm as a target, which is what many organizations have turned it into, becomes a real problem. Because at the end of the day, you only speak to any frontliner in any organization that is a zero harm as a target, and they don't believe it's attainable, and it probably isn't, because we've just said that, right, error is normal, mistakes and will happen. So while it's an aspiration, HOP is very much about saying, well, we need to focus on the big ticket items, so stuff that bankrupts us and stuff that kills people and creates, very serious life-altering injuries. We need to focus there, and it means we're going to have there will be harm along the way because we can't stop everything. We can't be everywhere. So that's kind of the word of caution with zero harm. If everyone understands in organizations on board that, yeah, okay, we get it. There will still be harm, but our aspiration is to create zero harm, probably fine. Zero harm as a target, yeah, bad idea.
David says, what are reactions from legislative regulators in relation to HOP?
It probably depends on the state you're in. I can certainly speak in relation to Queensland, where the state regulator has been very supportive of HOP and safety too, and safety differently type ideas. In fact, they've got a whole area which is promoting some of these ideas. So, are there going to be some regulators, and particularly people within the regulators, that are opposed? Yeah, of course there is. There will be people who are going to be, is with any new thing, they're going to be opposed just because it's new. But I think once the regulators see what kind of can be achieved and the sort of insight and understanding and knowledge that's delivered from this, they're generally going to be supportive. They're going to see that it's been a good thing, and you can make a very strong argument that it's actually many of the ideas within HOP actually go very strongly to doing good due diligence through getting an understanding of the system of work. It's good consultation and engagement of the workforce. So that you can make a strong argument that it actually is a good way of fulfilling many of your statutory obligations.
Okay, Shun asks, what is the largest barrier you see that inhibits industries to uptake HOP? My experience is legacy/current focus on lag data plays a part. Even regulators use this metric.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a barrier. I think for many, it's different to what they've always done. A lot of people, a lot of people who are not even within the safety profession, outside the safety profession, a lot of people don't know very much about what else is out there. So it's kind of like, well, we've always done safety this particular way. Essentially, safety is a compliance activity. We have all the various rules in place, and we just keep on reinventing similar sort of programs that we already have had or seen elsewhere. So organizations will try things like zero harm, behavior-based safety, some variation of that, or some bringing critical focus on critical controls, because they're just the things that they know. And so most people, once they have a bit of an understanding for what HOP is, generally, in my experience, most of the organizations we go and do even just an initial discussion with, they are immediately interested. So I think the biggest obstacle to overcome is making people aware that there are different ways of doing things. There's these new ideas out there.
Okay, well, that's the end of the questions, Andy. I just want to make the point that on the chat panel, there's a lot of excellent feedback. So thank you very much for that. And I've also shared a link to the upcoming webinars and podcasts. So hopefully we can have you back again soon to talk further on this.
Happy to come and talk about anything anytime, Sarah.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we'll send links out later today. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.